They made her remove her coat. The judge saw the tattoo and stood up in shock. What started as a simple courtroom hearing spiraled into something no one in the room was ready for. She looked like just another quiet witness. Plain clothes, calm eyes, nothing remarkable. But when that coat dropped, everything changed. The room froze. The judge turned pale. And for the first time in his 30 years on the bench, he called an immediate recess. Because that tattoo wasn't just ink, it was a ghost from the past, a symbol buried under 2 decades of silence. Suddenly, the case wasn't about money anymore, and someone who should never have walked back into that courtroom. Who is this woman really? And what truth does that tattoo threaten to unleash? Every time I see your comments, it reminds me how stories connect us all. Let me know where you're watching from, and let's get started. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as people filed in, taking their seats on the hard wooden benches. Among them sat Celeste Hartwell, her presence almost invisible despite her athletic frame. She tugged at her oversized coat, pulling it closer despite the warm spring weather that had everyone else in short sleeves. Judge Theodore Wilson's chambers door opened with a solid thud. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet room. The judge moved to his bench with measured steps, his silver hair catching the sunlight. His face, lined with 30 years of judicial experience, remained impassive as he settled into his chair. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice firm but tired. He shuffled through the papers before him, glancing over his reading glasses at the crowd. Case number 2023-478, United States versus Charlie Thornfield, on charges of corporate fraud and embezzlement. Charlie Thornfield sat at the defense table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his silver cufflinks catching the light when he moved. His confidence filled the room like expensive cologne, and his legal team, 3 lawyers in equally expensive suits, arranged their papers with practiced precision. From her seat in the gallery, Celeste watched it all. Her hands were folded quietly in her lap, but her eyes missed nothing. She noted how Thornfield leaned over to whisper something to his lead attorney, the small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She saw how Judge Wilson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he read through the case files. The prosecutor, a young woman in a navy suit, stood up. "Your Honor, the state calls its first witness in the matter of the missing charity funds. Mr. Thornfield's company, Thornfield Pharmaceuticals, received $45 million in donations meant for developing affordable medications for veterans. We intend to prove that Mr. Thornfield diverted these funds for personal use." Thornfield's lead attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, these allegations are baseless. My client has dedicated his life to serving the medical needs of our military personnel. These funds were properly allocated according to all legal requirements." Judge Wilson held up his hand. "Save your opening statement for the proper time, counselor." He turned to the prosecutor. "You may proceed with your first witness." The initial witness, an accountant, took the stand. His testimony was dry, full of numbers and spreadsheets projected onto a screen. Celeste noticed how some jurors' eyes glazed over, but she remained focused, watching Thornfield's reactions to each piece of evidence presented. The pharmaceutical executive maintained his composed demeanor, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or conferring quietly with his attorneys. But Celeste caught the slight tightening around his eyes when certain transactions were mentioned, the way his finger tapped silently against the table at specific dates. Judge Wilson maintained strict control over the proceedings, his voice cutting through any objections with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Counsel will approach the bench," he called out at one point, and both legal teams hurried forward for a hushed conference. Celeste shifted in her seat, her coat rustling softly. A young lawyer sitting nearby glanced at her, probably wondering why anyone would wear such heavy clothing in the warm weather. She gave him a small, forgettable smile and returned her attention to the proceedings. The morning wore on, with witness after witness taking the stand. Bank statements flashed across the screen, charity records were examined, and corporate documents were scrutinized. Through it all, Thornfield maintained his air of injured innocence, shaking his head slightly at particularly damaging testimony, as if saddened by such misunderstandings. Judge Wilson called for the lunch recess, his gavel cracking against the sound block. "Court will resume at 2 o'clock, he announced, standing up. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Celeste remained seated, watching Thornfield gather his things and leave with his legal team, their heads already together in consultation. She waited until the room had nearly emptied before standing up. Her coat settled around her like armor as she made her way toward the exit. Just before reaching the door, she paused, turning to look back at the judge's bench. Judge Wilson was still there, reviewing papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. For a moment, something flickered across his face, a shadow of old grief, quickly hidden behind judicial authority. Celeste's hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder, where beneath layers of clothing, a phoenix spread its wings across her skin. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her steps quiet but purposeful. What appeared to be a simple fraud case was about to become something much more significant. But for now, she kept her secrets wrapped around her as tightly as her oversized coat. The afternoon session began promptly at 2 o'clock. Celeste Hartwell sat in the witness box, her oversized coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, despite the warmth of the crowded courtroom. The prosecutor approached, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Please state your name for the record," she requested. "Celeste Hartwell," Celeste replied, her voice clear and steady. A security officer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, courthouse protocol requires all witnesses to remove outer garments for security purposes." Judge Wilson nodded, looking up from his notes. "Ms. Hartwell, please comply with security requirements." Celeste's fingers tightened on the coat's lapels for just a moment. Her face remained composed, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. The courtroom waited as she slowly stood, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Ms. Hartwell," Judge Wilson prompted again, his tone carrying the weight of authority earned over 30 years on the bench. "The coat, please." With careful movements, Celeste slipped the coat from her shoulders. She wore a simple, sleeveless blouse underneath, and as she turned to place the coat on the back of her chair, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the high windows illuminated her left shoulder. There, etched in permanent ink, was an intricate phoenix rising from flames. Below the majestic bird, in clear numbers, was the date, September 15th, 2003, and beneath that, the numbers 847. A sharp intake of breath cut through the quiet courtroom. Judge Wilson had risen from his seat, his hands gripping the edge of his bench. The color drained from his face as if someone had pulled a plug, leaving him ashen and shocked. His reading glasses clattered to the desktop, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The prosecutor stopped mid-step, her next question dying on her lips. Charlie Thornfield leaned forward in his chair, his usual smug expression replaced by confusion. His attorneys exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about this unexpected turn of events. The jurors sat frozen, some leaning forward to better see what had caused such a dramatic reaction from the normally stoic judge. The gallery had fallen completely silent. The usual shuffling and whispers ceased as if someone had pressed pause on the entire room. Judge Wilson's eyes remained fixed on the tattoo, his breathing visibly uneven. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the bench, his knuckles white from his grip. The lines in his face seemed to deepen as decades of carefully maintained judicial composure crumbled. Celeste turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, something passed between them, a flash of recognition, of shared knowledge. The weight of 20 years hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken words and buried truths. The prosecutor found her voice first. "Your Honor, is everything?" Judge Wilson held up a shaking hand, cutting her off. His eyes never left Celeste's face, searching it as if trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom everyone heard him clearly. "Flight 847, he said, the numbers coming out rough and ragged. Celeste gave a small nod, her posture military straight. "Yes, Your Honor." The bailiff took a step forward, concerned by the judge's obvious distress. but Judge Wilson waved him back. He sank slowly into his chair, still staring at Celeste as if she were a ghost made flesh. The defense table erupted in whispered conversation. Thornfield's lead attorney stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to this irregular proceeding. What bearing could a tattoo possibly have on these proceedings?" But Judge Wilson didn't seem to hear him. His eyes remained locked with Celeste's, seeing something far beyond the present moment. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where a photo of a young woman in military dress, his daughter Rachel, had rested in his pocket every day for the past 20 years. The prosecutor looked between her witness and the judge, clearly struggling to regain control of her carefully planned testimony. The jurors whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the judge's pale face and the phoenix tattoo on Celeste's shoulder. Celeste remained standing, her bearing steady and sure. The phoenix on her shoulder seemed to catch the light, the artistic flames appearing to move as she breathed. The date below it stood out stark and clear. September 15th, 2003. A day that had changed everything for both the witness and the judge. The courtroom remained suspended in this tableau. The shaken judge, the steady witness, the confused attorneys, and the spellbound audience, all held in place by the weight of a 20-year-old tragedy suddenly made present. The routine fraud case had transformed in an instant into something else entirely, something that reached back through the years to touch old wounds and uncover long-buried secrets. The usual sounds of the courthouse, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway, seemed muffled and far away. In this moment, there was only the silent communication between Judge Wilson and Celeste Hartwell, connected by a phoenix rising from flames and the numbers that had haunted them both for 2 decades. "This court is in recess." Judge Wilson's voice cracked as he brought down his gavel with trembling hands. "Everyone clear the courtroom, now!" The gallery erupted in confused murmurs as people began filing out. The defense attorneys huddled around their client, Charlie Thornfield, whose face showed clear annoyance at the interruption. The prosecutor gathered her papers, casting uncertain glances between Celeste and the judge. Judge Wilson stood unsteadily, his face still ashen. Without another word, he turned and disappeared through the door leading to his chambers. The heavy wooden door closed behind him with a solid thud. Celeste remained in the witness box, her military posture unchanged. She watched the door where the judge had vanished, conflict visible in her eyes. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped down from the witness stand and walked purposefully toward the judge's chambers. The bailiff moved to stop her, but something in her expression made him pause. She knocked firmly on the door. "Come in." The voice from inside sounded older, more fragile than it had moments before. Celeste entered, closing the door softly behind her. Judge Wilson stood at his window, his back to her, his shoulders hunched. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the book-lined walls of his chambers. "You died," he said quietly, still not turning around. 20 years ago. You all died. Rachel, ... His voice broke on his daughter's name. "Not all of us," Celeste replied softly. "I survived the crash." Judge Wilson turned then, his face lined with 2 decades of grief. Flight 847, the military transport, September 15th, 2003. He recited the date like a prayer he'd said countless times. My Rachel's last flight. "Lieutenant Rachel Wilson," Celeste confirmed, her own voice thick with emotion. "She was my best friend, sir. My sister in arms." The judge sank heavily into his leather chair, his legs seemingly unable to hold him any longer. The report said there were no survivors. The crash, the fire, they couldn't even identify the bodies properly. They weren't entirely wrong. Celeste moved closer, her steps measured. "I was so badly injured that I was initially tagged as deceased. By the time they realized their mistake, I was already being transported to a military hospital under a different name. When I learned what had happened..." She paused, collecting herself. "When I learned the truth about the crash, I made a choice to stay dead." Judge Wilson's hands clenched on his armrests. "The truth about the crash? What truth?" "It wasn't an accident, sir." Celeste's voice hardened. The equipment failure that brought down Flight 847 was preventable. The company knew about the defect but covered it up to protect their profits. The judge's breath caught. His hand moved automatically to his chest pocket, where he kept the worn photograph of Rachel in her uniform. How do you know this? Because I've spent the last 20 years gathering evidence, Celeste replied. That's why I'm here today. Charlie Thornfield isn't just guilty of embezzlement. His company manufactured the defective parts that brought down our transport. The fraud case is just the tip of the iceberg. Judge Wilson stared at her, his judicial mask completely stripped away, leaving only a father's raw grief. Rachel. She wrote to me about you. Her letters were full of stories about her friend Celeste. The two of you went through basic training together. Yes, sir. Celeste's composure wavered for the first time. She was the finest soldier I ever knew, the bravest person I ever met. She deserved better than what happened to her. 20 years, the judge whispered. For 20 years I've lived with the official story. A tragic accident. Unavoidable. An act of God. His voice grew stronger, anger seeping in. But you're telling me my daughter's death was preventable? That someone knew? Yes, sir. Celeste's response was firm. That's why I got this tattoo. The phoenix, rising from the ashes of Flight 847. I needed something permanent to remind me of my purpose, to honor Rachel and all the others we lost that day. Judge Wilson stood slowly, his earlier shock transforming into something more focused. You have evidence? Files, documents, testimonies. Everything needed to prove what really happened. Celeste met his gaze steadily. I've spent 2 decades building an airtight case, but I needed a way to present it that couldn't be buried or dismissed. When I saw Thornfield was finally being prosecuted for fraud. You found your opening, the judge finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 20 years of secrets and grief hanging between them. Through the window, they could hear the muffled sounds of the courthouse, life continuing as normal while their world had just shifted on its axis. Rachel would be proud of you, Judge Wilson said finally, his voice rough with emotion. She always said you were the most determined person she'd ever met. Celeste's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. She was my best friend, sir. I couldn't let her death mean nothing. I couldn't let them get away with it. Judge Wilson moved to his desk, pulling out a thick file labeled Flight 847 Investigation. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The official report cited mechanical failure due to extreme weather conditions. Are you telling me that was a lie? Not a lie, exactly. Celeste stepped closer, her voice steady but filled with carefully controlled anger. The mechanical failure was real, but what they didn't reveal was that the parts were defective from the start. Thornfield's company, MedTech Solutions, had the military contract for our transport's critical life support and emergency systems. She reached into her bag and pulled out a weathered manila envelope. These are internal memos from 2002, showing they knew about defects in the emergency oxygen deployment system. But instead of recalling the units, they buried the reports. Profits over lives. Judge Wilson took the documents with shaking hands. My God, he whispered, scanning the pages. They knew. All this time, they knew. It gets worse, Celeste continued, her composure cracking slightly. After I recovered enough to think clearly, I started digging. Found a pattern. MedTech wasn't just cutting corners on transport equipment. They were systematically supplying substandard medical supplies to military units. Defective field kits, compromised medications, faulty emergency equipment. Flight 847 wasn't their only victim, just their most visible one. The judge sank back into his chair, the weight of these revelations visible in every line of his face. How did you survive? The report said the crash site was... He couldn't finish the sentence. I was thrown clear during the initial impact, Celeste explained, unconsciously touching her left shoulder where the phoenix tattoo marked her skin. Suffered severe burns, broken bones, internal injuries. When the first responders found me, they assumed I was already gone. Tagged me as deceased. By the time they realized their mistake at the field hospital, I was being treated under a John Doe designation. She paused, collecting herself. That's when I made the decision to stay dead. I knew something wasn't right about the crash. If I was officially alive, I'd never be able to investigate freely. Being legally deceased gave me the freedom to dig without anyone watching. 20 years, Judge Wilson murmured. You spent 20 years building this case? It took time to heal first, Celeste admitted. Multiple surgeries, years of physical therapy. But even then, I had to be careful. Gather evidence that couldn't be disputed. Create an airtight chain of custody. I couldn't risk coming forward until I was absolutely certain they couldn't bury it again. She pulled out more documents from her bag. These are internal financial records showing how Thornfield personally approved the use of substandard materials to increase profit margins. Testimony from former employees about falsified safety tests. Evidence of systematic cover-ups spanning almost 2 decades. Judge Wilson spread the documents across his desk, his judicial training warring with his personal anguish. This changes everything about the current case. The fraud charges we're hearing today are just a smokescreen for something far worse. That's why I came forward now, Celeste explained. The embezzlement case got Thornfield into a federal courtroom. Once he's convicted of financial crimes, these documents become admissible as evidence of a larger pattern of criminal behavior, but I can't be the judge, Wilson finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Not now. Not when my daughter was one of the victims. This is a massive conflict of interest. I know, Celeste acknowledged softly. I'm sorry. I didn't want to compromise your position, but I needed to make sure this evidence reached the right hands. Rachel always said you were the most honest person she knew, that you'd never let politics or pressure stop you from doing what's right. Judge Wilson stood, moving to the window again. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, highlighting how much the years of grief had aged him. All this time, he said quietly, I thought I had accepted her death, learned to live with it, but knowing it wasn't just fate or bad luck. His hands clenched into fists, knowing someone made a conscious choice that led to my daughter's death. Rachel deserves justice, Celeste said firmly. They all do. Every soldier who died because Thornfield valued profits over lives. Every family that was torn apart because of corporate greed. The judge turned back to face her, his expression transformed by newfound purpose. You're right. But we have to do this properly. By the book. No legal loopholes they can exploit. No procedural errors they can use to escape responsibility. He began gathering the documents, his movements precise and controlled. I'll have to recuse myself immediately. Request a special prosecutor. Make sure every piece of evidence is properly logged and authenticated. There's a risk, Celeste warned. Once Thornfield realizes what's happening, he won't go down without a fight. He has resources, connections, the kind of money that can make problems disappear. Let him try, Judge Wilson replied, steel entering his voice. He's about to learn that some things can't be buried forever. Some truths demand to be heard. Celeste reached deeper into her bag, pulling out a worn leather journal with military markings. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. There's something else you need to see. Something about Rachel's final moments. Judge Wilson's breath caught. What do you mean? This was recovered from the crash site, Celeste explained, her voice soft with reverence. It's the flight medic's log. He documented everything that happened in those last minutes. She opened the journal carefully, its pages yellowed with age. Rachel. She was trying to save people until the very end. The judge took the journal with shaking hands. I never knew. They wouldn't tell us details about those final moments. When the primary oxygen system failed, Rachel took charge of emergency medical response, Celeste continued, pointing to specific entries. The backup systems were failing too, Thornfield's faulty equipment. But Rachel wouldn't give up. She went from soldier to soldier trying to help them breathe. Judge Wilson's eyes moved across the pages, taking in the hurried handwriting that documented his daughter's final acts of bravery. She knew the systems were failing. Yes, Celeste nodded, wiping away a tear. The medic wrote that she kept trying different emergency kits, moving through the cabin even as the plane was going down. She used her own oxygen mask to help others. The last entry ... Her voice broke slightly. The last entry shows she was trying to revive Private Martinez when... The judge pressed his hand to his mouth, overwhelmed by emotion. "That was Rachel," he whispered, "always putting others first, even at the end." Celeste pulled out another document, this one marked with multiple classified stamps. "This is the full technical analysis of the emergency equipment recovered from the crash site. Every single oxygen kit Rachel tried to use was defective. The internal seals were made with substandard materials that Thornfield personally approved to save money." Meanwhile, in the main courtroom, Charlie Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The recess had gone on far too long, and the judge's dramatic reaction to the witness's tattoo troubled him deeply. He leaned over to whisper to his lead attorney. "Find out what's happening," he hissed. "That recess should have ended 20 minutes ago, and I want everything you can find on that witness, Celeste Hartwell. Something's not right." His attorney nodded discreetly and left the courtroom while Thornfield pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen as he sent urgent messages to his security team. Years of carefully managed public appearances and strategic charitable donations had built him a sterling reputation. He wouldn't let it be threatened now. Back in the judge's chambers, Wilson studied the technical report with growing horror. These failure rates, they knew this would happen eventually. They had to know. "They did," Celeste confirmed. "I found internal risk assessments showing they calculated the probable failure rates. They decided the potential lawsuits would cost less than recalling and replacing the equipment." The judge's hands clenched into fists. "They put a price on my daughter's life, on all those lives." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "But we have to be careful how we proceed. If we make one wrong move, Thornfield's lawyers will use it to get everything thrown out." "He's probably already suspicious," Celeste agreed, glancing at the clock. "This recess is unusual. He'll be looking into me, trying to figure out what triggered your reaction." "Then we need to move quickly but carefully," Wilson said, his judicial training taking over. "I'll recuse myself immediately, cite a personal conflict of interest. That's irregular but not unprecedented. Then we get these documents to the federal prosecutor's office before Thornfield can react." Celeste nodded. "I have everything backed up in multiple secure locations. If anything happens to me..." "Don't," the judge cut her off sharply. "I've already lost Rachel. I won't lose you too, not when you've brought me the truth about her final moments." He moved to his desk, beginning to write. "We'll do this by the book. Every I dotted, every T crossed. For Rachel, for all of them." "She would be proud of you," Celeste said softly. "She used to tell us stories about her father, the judge who never let the powerful escape justice." Wilson's pen paused briefly. "I hope she knew how proud I was of her. Not just for her service, but for who she was. Learning how she died, trying to save others even when she must have known." He took a deep breath. "It hurts, but it also feels right. That was who she was." Through the window, they could see Thornfield's attorney returning to the courtroom, speaking urgently into his phone. Time was running out. "Are you ready?" Celeste asked, gathering the documents carefully. Judge Wilson straightened his robes, his expression set with determination. "For 20 years, I thought I had to accept that Rachel's death was just a tragic accident. Now I know it was the result of deliberate choices made by men who valued money over human lives." He picked up his gavel. "Yes, I'm ready. Let's make sure justice is finally served." The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as Judge Theodore Wilson returned to his seat. His face was composed, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he arranged his papers. Celeste Hartwell walked to the witness stand, her shoulders straight, the phoenix tattoo now visible beneath her sleeveless blouse. Charlie Thornfield leaned forward, studying her with narrowed eyes. His legal team huddled close, whispering urgently about the extended recess and the judge's unusual behavior. Something had changed, but they couldn't quite grasp what. "Ms. Hartwell," the prosecutor began. "Please continue your testimony regarding the charitable donations made by Thornfield Pharmaceuticals." Celeste's voice was clear and steady. "The company's records show systematic diversion of funds from their military family support initiative. Money meant for families of fallen service members was instead used to fund executive bonuses and private investments." Thornfield relaxed slightly. This was familiar territory, allegations they'd prepared for months to defend against. His lead attorney already had documentation ready to explain every transaction. But then Celeste continued. However, the embezzlement was actually a cover for something far more serious. She pulled out a thick folder. "I have here contracts between Thornfield Pharmaceuticals and the Department of Defense dating back to 2001. Thornfield's spine stiffened. His attorney grabbed his arm, but he barely felt it. "These contracts," Celeste said, "were for emergency medical equipment, specifically oxygen delivery systems and field trauma kits." She met Thornfield's eyes across the courtroom. "Equipment that was manufactured with substandard materials to increase profit margins." The prosecutor looked startled. This wasn't part of their prepared testimony. But before anyone could object, Celeste produced another document. This is an internal memo from Mr. Thornfield himself, acknowledging that the replacement of military-grade components with cheaper alternatives could lead to equipment failures. The memo includes a cost analysis comparing potential lawsuit settlements against the savings from using inferior materials. Thornfield's face had gone ash gray. His hands trembled as he scribbled a note to his attorney. "Stop her. Now." The lead defense attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This goes well beyond the scope of the current charges. We haven't been provided with these documents during discovery." Judge Wilson's voice was steady. "The witness is presenting evidence of a broader criminal conspiracy that came to light during the fraud investigation. I'll allow it." Thornfield stared at the judge, suddenly understanding the significance of that phoenix tattoo. His mind raced through military contracts, crash reports, sealed settlements. Flight 847. The crash everyone had forgotten about, or so he'd thought. Celeste continued methodically presenting evidence. Internal quality control reports, safety test failures that were buried, warnings from engineers that were ignored. With each document, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. "On September 15, 2003, she said, her voice unwavering, a military transport carrying 23 service members crashed when multiple oxygen systems failed simultaneously. The systems that failed were all manufactured by Thornfield Pharmaceuticals." Thornfield's carefully maintained facade cracked. He grabbed a fresh legal pad, writing frantically, "Call our crisis team. Now. Get everyone who knows about the military contracts on the phone." But Celeste wasn't finished. She produced maintenance logs, inspection reports, and detailed analysis of the recovered equipment. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose, showing not just negligence but deliberate choices that prioritized profit over safety. The defense team's objections grew increasingly desperate. They cited national security concerns, questioned the document's authenticity, argued about jurisdiction. But Judge Wilson overruled them all, his voice growing firmer with each objection. Thornfield watched his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The charity fraud charges had been manageable, a few years of litigation, maybe a fine, some bad press. But this was different. This was about dead soldiers, about families destroyed, about 2 decades of covering up the truth. He loosened his tie, feeling trapped. His eyes darted around the courtroom, noting exits, calculating options. The confident corporate executive was gone, replaced by a man realizing he might never see freedom again. Celeste's testimony continued, her voice remaining steady as she methodically laid out the evidence of years of criminal negligence. The jury leaned forward, their expressions shifting from interest to horror as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Thornfield's legal team was in disarray, their carefully prepared defense strategy, built around explaining away financial discrepancies, was useless against these new revelations. They shuffled through papers frantically, trying to find some way to counter this unexpected testimony, But Thornfield barely heard them now. His eyes were fixed on Celeste's phoenix tattoo. He remembered signing off on those cost-cutting measures, remembered dismissing warnings about potential failures. He'd told himself it was just business, just numbers on a spreadsheet. Now those numbers had a face, and that face was staring back at him from the witness stand, methodically destroying everything he'd built. The testimony continued, but Thornfield's mind was already racing ahead, considering options he'd never thought he'd need. In his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed continuously as his crisis team tried to reach him, but he didn't answer. He knew it was too late for crisis management. This was about survival now. As court adjourned for lunch, Celeste felt the familiar prickle at the back of her neck, the sensation that had kept her alive during her military service. Someone was watching. She scanned the courthouse hallway, noting 3 men who didn't quite fit. Their suits were expensive but didn't hang right, concealing what she knew must be weapons. Judge Wilson caught her eye from his chamber doorway. He'd noticed them too, his years on the bench having taught him to spot trouble. He hesitated, clearly torn between his judicial duty to remain neutral and his instinct to help his daughter's friend. Celeste gave him a slight nod. She didn't need help. She'd spent 20 years preparing for this moment. Her hand brushed the messenger bag containing the evidence, making sure it was secure across her body. The physical therapy and combat training she'd maintained during her recovery were about to be tested. The first attacker made his move near the courthouse steps. A man in a charcoal suit reached inside his jacket. Celeste was already moving, using a passing group of lawyers as cover. The silenced shot hit marble where she'd been standing a second before. People screamed and scattered. Celeste sprinted down the side street, her muscles remembering years of military drills. Her body protested, old injuries from the crash making themselves known, but she pushed through the pain. Behind her, she heard the controlled footsteps of professional killers. Judge Wilson watched from his window as the chase began. He grabbed his phone, fingers hovering over the number for courthouse security. But calling them might make things worse. Thornfield surely had people on the inside. The judge's hand trembled as he set the phone down, praying he'd made the right choice. Celeste ducked into an alley using a dumpster for cover. 2 of the men ran past while the third hung back, watching. Smart. They were well trained. She pulled out her phone, quickly transferring photos of key documents to a secure cloud server. If something happened to her, the evidence would still survive. A shot pinged off the metal beside her head. She rolled, coming up behind a stack of wooden pallets. The third man was good. He doubled back while his partners drew her attention. But Celeste had been expecting this move. She kicked the pallets, sending them crashing toward him. As he dodged, she closed the distance. The fight was brief and brutal. Her elbow found his throat before he could bring his weapon around. She stripped the gun from his hands with a move she'd practiced thousands of times during her recovery. He dropped, gasping, and she was already running. Back in the courthouse, Charlie Thornfield paced in a conference room, phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what it costs," he hissed. "Stop her. Those documents cannot reach the media." His carefully maintained corporate image had cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath. Celeste emerged onto a busy street, blending with the lunch crowd. Her pursuers were good, but she was better. 20 years of living under an assumed identity had taught her how to disappear in plain sight. She ducked into a coffee shop, exiting through their back door into a service corridor. The 2 remaining men split up, trying to cut off her escape routes. They hadn't expected her to go up. Celeste climbed a fire escape, her old wounds screaming in protest. The rooftop offered multiple escape routes, something she'd noted while planning for this day. A bullet sparked off the metal railing beside her. One of the men had spotted her. She sprinted across the rooftop, vaulting between buildings. The messenger bag thumped against her side, precious evidence secure inside. Her breathing was controlled, measured, just like during her military training. The chase continued through the city's maze of alleys and side streets. Celeste used every trick she'd learned, both from her military days and her years in hiding. She ducked through service entrances, used delivery trucks as cover, and doubled back to confuse her pursuers. Judge Wilson watched the courthouse security feeds, his judicial neutrality warring with his need to help. He saw Thornfield still in the conference room, now surrounded by lawyers. The judge's hands clenched as he thought of Rachel, of how she died trying to save others. He made his decision. Celeste finally lost her pursuers in a crowded shopping center. She found a secure spot to catch her breath, checking the evidence was intact. Her body ached from the exertion, old injuries reminding her of the crash that had started all this. But the pain only strengthened her resolve. The attack had confirmed what she'd always suspected. Thornfield would stop at nothing to keep his crimes hidden. She'd spent 20 years gathering evidence, building her strength, and preparing for this moment. Now she knew the full scope of what she was dealing with. Thornfield hadn't just hired killers. He'd hired professionals. This was only his first attempt, and he would escalate. She checked her phone. The evidence was safe in multiple locations now. Even if something happened to her, the truth about Flight 847 would come out. She'd made sure of that. But she hadn't survived 20 years just to fail now. She'd seen this through for Rachel and for all the others who had died because of Thornfield's greed. Celeste sat in a small diner 3 blocks from the courthouse, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. Her muscles ached from the chase, but her mind remained sharp. The television mounted in the corner suddenly caught her attention as a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. "Breaking news in the Thornfield pharmaceutical fraud case," the reporter announced. "Sources reveal that key witness Celeste Hartwell has been living under a false identity for 20 years, raising questions about her credibility." Her phone buzzed with a message from Judge Wilson. "Emergency hearing in 1 hour. Thornfield's lawyers are moving to dismiss your testimony." Back in the courthouse, Thornfield's legal team worked with military precision. They'd prepared thick folders of documents challenging Celeste's identity, her right to testify, and the admissibility of her evidence. Thornfield himself stood at the window of his attorney's office, his composed exterior restored, but his eyes revealing barely contained rage. "She's been living under a false identity since 2003, Thornfield's lead attorney argued before Judge Wilson. "Every document she's submitted, every statement she's made, is fruit of a poisoned tree. How can any court trust the testimony of someone who's been living a lie for 2 decades? Judge Wilson sat rigid behind his bench, his face a mask of judicial neutrality that concealed his inner turmoil. The law was clear about witnesses who had committed identity fraud, but he also knew why Celeste had done it, to gather evidence about his own daughter's death. Celeste stood at the defendant's podium, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "I assumed a new identity after being incorrectly declared dead in the crash of Flight 847. My actions were necessary to uncover the truth about corporate negligence that killed 19 service members." Before the judge could rule, Thornfield's attorney presented another motion. "Your Honor, given your daughter's connection to this case, we move for your immediate recusal. Your continued involvement represents a clear conflict of interest." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Wilson gripped his gavel, knowing that his recusal would likely end the case. A new judge would almost certainly dismiss Celeste's testimony given her false identity. 20 years of gathering evidence could unravel in a single moment. But Thornfield wasn't done. His phone buzzed on the table and he smiled coldly at Celeste. "Ms. Hartwell, or whatever your real name is, might want to check on the families of her former unit members." Celeste's blood ran cold as messages started appearing on her phone. The sister of her former squad mate reporting suspicious men outside her house. The parents of another victim being followed on their way to work. A widow receiving threatening photos of her children at school. "You're going to withdraw your testimony," Thornfield said quietly, his words carrying across the nearly empty courtroom. "Or these families will suffer the consequences. I'm sure you don't want more deaths on your conscience." Judge Wilson watched the exchange, seeing the weight of impossible choices settle on Celeste's shoulders. The same choices he now faced, between doing what was legally right and what was morally right, between protecting his judicial integrity and seeking justice for his daughter. "The court will recess for 1 hour to consider these motions," Judge Wilson announced, his voice heavy. In his chambers, he stared at Rachel's photo on his desk. She smiled back at him in her military uniform, forever young, forever lost. Celeste paced in an empty conference room, her phone buzzing with more messages from frightened families. She had spent 20 years pursuing justice, but now that pursuit was putting innocent people at risk. The evidence she had gathered could convict Thornfield, but only if it was admissible. Only if Judge Wilson stayed on the case. Only if she was willing to sacrifice others to achieve her goal. Thornfield's legal team worked methodically, filing motion after motion. They challenged every piece of evidence, every document, every statement. They were building a wall of legal obstacles that could bury the truth under procedural challenges and technical dismissals. "You can't win this," Thornfield told her during a chance encounter in the courthouse hallway. "Even if some of the evidence survives, how many families are you willing to endanger? How many children should suffer for your vendetta?" Celeste stood at the window, watching the city below. The same choice that had haunted her military service now confronted her again. The choice between completing the mission and protecting innocent lives. Between justice and mercy. Between vengeance and protection. Judge Wilson faced his own impossible decision. The law demanded his recusal. His oath required him to step aside, but doing so would derail the only chance at justice his daughter's death might ever see. 20 years of waiting for answers would end in procedural dismissal and legal technicalities. The hour of recess ticked away as both Celeste and Judge Wilson wrestled with their choices. Thornfield had turned the legal system against them while simultaneously threatening innocent families. He had transformed their quest for justice into a moral maze where every path seemed to lead to compromise or failure. Celeste worked quickly in the courthouse library, surrounded by stacks of documents and her laptop. Her military training had taught her to always have backup plans, and now she was activating every resource she'd carefully put in place over the past 20 years. "I need those original medical records from Walter Reed," she spoke quietly into her phone. "Yes, the ones from 2003. They'll prove my identity beyond doubt." She hung up and immediately dialed another number. "Agent Martinez? It's time to call in that favor. I need protection details for 5 families, immediately." Down the hall, Judge Wilson sat in his chambers, legal texts open before him. His clerk had just delivered another stack of motions from Thornfield's attorneys, each one designed to dismantle the case piece by piece. The judge's eyes kept drifting to Rachel's photo, but he forced himself to focus on the law. A knock at his door revealed Celeste carrying a thick folder. "Your Honor, I have something you need to see." She spread out documents across his desk, her original military ID, DNA test results from the crash site, and medical records from her recovery. "I kept copies of everything. Thornfield's team can challenge my current identity, but they can't erase who I was." Judge Wilson examined the papers carefully. "This proves you're who you say you are, but it doesn't solve our bigger problem. My continued involvement compromises the entire case." "I know," Celeste said quietly, "but I need you to help me ensure the evidence reaches the right person before you step down." In another part of the courthouse, Thornfield paced in his attorney's office, his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what it costs. Keep those families under surveillance. She needs to understand the consequences of continuing this crusade." His smugness faded as his assistant rushed in with urgent news. "Sir, federal agents are moving the families to safe locations. Someone's countering our surveillance teams." Celeste's phone buzzed with updates from Agent Martinez. "All families secured," the text read. "Witness protection protocols activated." She allowed herself a small smile. Thornfield wasn't the only one with resources. Judge Wilson spent the afternoon in careful consultation with the chief judge, explaining the complexity of the case while deliberately omitting his personal connection. Together, they identified Judge Sarah Chen, known for her expertise in corporate criminal cases, as the ideal replacement. Back in the courtroom, Thornfield's attorneys presented their motion for recusal with triumphant confidence. Judge Wilson listened to their arguments, his face betraying nothing of the decision he'd already reached. "Before ruling on this motion," he announced, "the court will hear evidence regarding the witness's identity." He nodded to Celeste, who approached with her documentation. For the next hour, she methodically presented her evidence. Military records, DNA tests, medical documentation, sworn statements from doctors who had treated her after the crash. Each document built an irrefutable chain of proof that she was indeed who she claimed to be. The court finds no reason to doubt the witness's identity, Judge Wilson declared. However, the defense's motion regarding judicial recusal has merit. He paused, looking directly at Thornfield. I hereby recuse myself from this case. It will be reassigned to Judge Chen, who will review all evidence and testimony from the beginning. Thornfield's attorneys exchanged worried glances. Judge Chen's reputation for thoroughness and immunity to corporate pressure was well known. As the courtroom cleared, Celeste received another message from her network. Thornfield making calls to private security firms. Looks like he's planning something big. She watched him leave the courthouse, noting how his controlled exterior had begun to crack. His usual confident stride had been replaced by jerky, nervous movements. His eyes darted around constantly, like a cornered animal searching for escape. Judge Wilson called Celeste into his chambers one final time. I've arranged for Judge Chen to receive a complete briefing first thing tomorrow morning. She'll understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Thank you, Celeste said softly. I know how hard this decision was. Rachel would have wanted the truth to come out the right way, he replied, touching his daughter's photo. But be careful. A man like Thornfield is most dangerous when he's desperate. Celeste nodded, already mentally preparing for whatever desperate measures Thornfield might attempt. She'd spent 20 years planning for justice. She could handle one more day of waiting. As she left the courthouse, she noticed several suspicious men watching the building exits. Thornfield was definitely planning something. She pulled out her phone and began activating her final contingency plans. Whatever he was planning, she would be ready. The sun was setting over the city as Judge Chen received her first briefing about the case she would inherit tomorrow. She sat in her office, reading through the preliminary documents, unaware that she was about to step into one of the most significant cases of her career. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Celeste made her way through security. Something felt off. The usual guards were missing, replaced by unfamiliar faces who barely glanced at her ID. Her military instincts, honed through 20 years of waiting, screamed danger. Inside the courtroom, Judge Chen was reviewing documents at her bench when Thornfield burst through the doors. Gone was the polished executive in expensive suits. His tie hung loose, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held a wild gleam. Behind him, 4 armed men in security uniforms spread out across the room. "Nobody moves!" Thornfield's voice cracked with desperation. "Everyone stay exactly where you are." The fake guards quickly herded the scattered court personnel, including 3 jurors who had arrived early, toward the center of the room. One of them slammed the heavy wooden doors shut and secured them with chains. Celeste remained perfectly still, her mind racing through combat scenarios. She counted weapons, assessed positions, noted potential escape routes. 20 years of physical therapy hadn't just rebuilt her body. It had prepared her for exactly this moment. "You really think this will help your case, Charlie?" Judge Chen's voice cut through the panic, remarkably calm. Thornfield laughed, a harsh sound with no humor. "My case? You think I care about legal proceedings now?" He paced in front of the bench, gesturing wildly with a pistol. 20 years of building everything, all destroyed because one dead soldier wouldn't stay dead. His eyes locked onto Celeste. "You should have died in that crash with the others. Do you know how much money we made from those contracts? Millions. Who cares if some equipment wasn't perfect? It was just business." "Rachel cared," Celeste said quietly, watching his gun hand shake. "She died trying to save others with your defective supplies. It wasn't just business to her." A court clerk tried to inch toward the door. One of the armed men roughly shoved her back, sending her stumbling into a juror. The elderly man helped her up, his hands trembling. Thornfield's facade cracked further. "Shut up. You don't get to talk about casualties and heroism. I built an empire. I employed thousands. A few military deaths were just overhead." "Overhead?" Celeste's voice turned cold. "Is that what you told yourself when you signed off on those shipments? When you knew the equipment would fail? We had shareholders to think about. Thornfield was shouting now, spittle flying from his lips. Profit margins, market share. You think corporate America cares about a few dead soldiers? One of his men shifted uncomfortably. Boss, we need to move. Police will be here soon. Thornfield spun around, waving his gun erratically. No one's going anywhere. Not until I figure out how to fix this. His carefully maintained corporate mask had completely shattered, revealing the desperate man beneath. Celeste watched him unravel, noting how his attention darted between targets. She had spent 20 years planning for justice, but now justice would require action, not testimony. Her body tensed, ready to move. There's nothing to fix, Charlie, she said calmly. It's over. The evidence is already out there. Killing us won't change that. Shut up! He swung the gun toward her. You're the reason everything's falling apart. You and your precious dead friends. A police siren wailed in the distance. One of the armed men moved to the window. Police units approaching. Multiple vehicles. Thornfield's composure completely dissolved. No, I won't let them take everything. I won't go to prison. He grabbed the nearest juror, an elderly woman, and pressed the gun to her head. Everyone back! I'll kill her, I swear I'll do it. The woman whimpered and something in Celeste snapped. She had watched her friends die 20 years ago because of this man's greed. Never again. She shifted her weight slightly, preparing to move. 2 decades of physical therapy had rebuilt her strength, restored her reflexes, prepared her body for this moment. Her mind was clear, focused, just as it had been in combat. Last chance, Charlie, she said quietly. Put the gun down. He responded with a hysterical laugh. Or what? You'll testify against me some more? I'm already finished, but I'm taking you with me. He swung the gun toward Celeste, and in that moment of distraction, she moved. 20 years of preparation unleashed in a blur of motion. Her hand caught his wrist, twisting sharply. The gun clattered to the floor as she drove her knee into his solar plexus. The armed men raised their weapons, but Celeste already had Thornfield in a chokehold, using him as a shield. Drop them, she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a trained soldier. Now! The men hesitated, looking at their gasping employer. Outside, police sirens grew louder. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. She's just one person, Thornfield wheezed. Shoot her. But his men saw something different. A warrior who had survived impossible odds, who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. They saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, the precision of her movements, the coiled strength in her stance. One by one, they lowered their weapons. The armed men's weapons clattered to the ground, but Celeste knew the danger wasn't over. She maintained her hold on Thornfield while scanning the room. 3 exits, 12 hostages, 4 disarmed attackers. Her military training kicked in automatically, assessing threats and planning moves. Everyone move slowly toward the side door, she commanded, keeping her voice steady and authoritative. Ma'am, please help the elderly gentleman. She nodded to a young court clerk, who immediately assisted one of the jurors. Thornfield struggled in her grip. You think this changes anything? I have more men outside. You can't… She tightened her hold, cutting off his words. Those aren't your men outside, that's SWAT. I recognize their approach pattern. The distant sirens had changed tone, indicating tactical units were in position. Your backup isn't coming. One of Thornfield's men made a sudden move toward a dropped weapon. Celeste reacted instantly, sweeping Thornfield's legs while maintaining her grip. They hit the ground together, her years of training ensuring she kept control. The would-be hero froze as she smoothly drew Thornfield's backup gun from his ankle holster. Don't, she said simply. The man backed away, hands raised. The hostages were almost to the side door when Thornfield made his desperate play. He drove his elbow back, catching Celeste in the ribs, right where her old crash injuries had left permanent damage. Pain flared through her body, but 20 years of physical therapy had taught her to work through pain. Thornfield broke free and lunged for the nearest hostage, Judge Chen. But Celeste had anticipated his move. She'd spent 2 decades studying his patterns, his corporate reports, his behavior under pressure. She knew he always attacked what he perceived as authority. Before his hands could reach the judge, Celeste tackled him from behind. They crashed into the first row of benches, splintering wood. Celeste rolled through the impact, protecting her vulnerable spots while maintaining control of his arms. "Get them out!" she shouted to the court clerk, who was helping guide the last hostages through the side door. Judge Chen hesitated at the threshold. "Go!" Celeste commanded, deflecting Thornfield's attempt to gouge her eyes. "Make sure my evidence reaches the Attorney General." The judge nodded sharply and disappeared through the door. Now only Celeste, Thornfield, and his 4 disarmed men remained in the courtroom. Through the windows, she could see SWAT teams taking position. "Kill her!" Thornfield screamed at his men. "I'll pay you double, triple exclamation mark." But his hired muscle had seen enough. They knew the difference between providing private security and facing federal charges. One by one, they moved toward the main doors, hands raised in surrender. "Nobody wants to die for you, Charlie," Celeste said, maintaining her hold as he thrashed. "It's over." "It's never over." He slammed his head back, trying to catch her face. She shifted smoothly, letting the blow glance off her shoulder. "I'll hire more men. I'll find your family, your friends." "I don't have any family," she cut him off. "You made sure of that 20 years ago. And my friends?" Her voice turned cold. "You killed them all on Flight 847. Remember?" His struggles intensified. "It was just business. We had quotas to meet, projections to hit." "Rachel had a quota too," Celeste said, tightening her hold as he bucked against her grip. "She was supposed to save lives, and she died trying, using your defective equipment." SWAT teams breached the doors, weapons raised. Celeste identified herself clearly, keeping Thornfield pinned as they approached. But he had one last card to play. "I'll tell everyone," he shouted, "about the classified missions, the secret operations. I'll expose everything." "No, Charlie," Celeste said calmly. "You'll face justice, in court, with evidence and testimony in due process. Everything you denied Rachel and the others." She smoothly shifted her grip, allowing the SWAT team to secure him. As they hauled him up, he stared at her with wild eyes. "You could have killed me," he spat. "Why didn't you?" Celeste stood slowly, feeling the old familiar ache in her healing bones. "Because Rachel wouldn't have. She believed in saving lives, not taking them, even yours." She watched as they led him away, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his corporate mask completely shattered. 20 years of planning, of painful rehabilitation, of gathering evidence, all to ensure he faced proper justice, not vigilante revenge. A SWAT commander approached her. "Ma'am, are you injured? We need to clear the scene." Celeste shook her head. "I'm fine, just some old wounds making themselves known." She looked around the damaged courtroom, at the splintered benches and scattered papers. "The evidence is already being secured," the commander assured her. "Judge Chen contacted the Attorney General's office directly. They're sending a team." Celeste nodded, feeling the weight of 20 years finally beginning to lift. She had achieved what she'd set out to do, not through violence or revenge, but through persistence and an unwavering commitment to justice. Rachel would have been proud of that. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Judge Chen delivered the verdict. Celeste sat in the front row, her posture straight but relaxed, no longer needing to hide. Judge Wilson sat beside her, their shared presence a testament to how far they'd come. "Charlie Thornfield," Judge Chen's voice rang through the packed courtroom. "This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the gallery. 20 years of covered-up crimes, of families wondering why their loved ones died, finally met justice. Thornfield's face had gone ashen, his expensive suit no longer able to mask the defeated man beneath. Judge Chen continued, "Furthermore, your company will pay $1 billion in damages to the families of military personnel affected by your criminal negligence. All contracts with the military are permanently revoked." Celeste watched as federal marshals led Thornfield away. His shoulders slumped, his carefully maintained corporate mask completely shattered. She felt no joy in his defeat, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally come to light. After the sentencing, Celeste met with the Attorney General's team. Her carefully gathered evidence had sparked a comprehensive investigation into military supply contracts. New regulations were being drafted, requiring stricter testing and accountability measures. Rachel's death, and the deaths of so many others, would help protect future service members. "Your testimony changed everything," the lead investigator told her. "We're looking at industry-wide reforms. No more cutting corners on military equipment." Celeste nodded, thinking of Rachel checking medical supplies before that final flight. "It's what she would have wanted," she said quietly. "She always put others first." The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Celeste drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where Judge Wilson waited by Rachel's grave. The white headstone stood among thousands of others, each representing a story of service and sacrifice. "I've visited every week for 20 years, Wilson said as Celeste approached. "But today feels different." Celeste knelt and placed fresh flowers beside the headstone. The marble was cool under her fingers as she traced Rachel's name. "She saved 3 people that day," she said softly. "Using those defective supplies, knowing they might fail. She kept trying until the end." Wilson's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Celeste, not just for exposing the truth, but for showing me how she died. Knowing she spent her final moments trying to help others. It means everything." They stood together in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming their faces. Finally, Wilson spoke again. "What will you do now? You don't have to hide anymore." Celeste smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I'm starting a foundation for military families affected by contractor negligence. There are still so many people who need help navigating the system, fighting for accountability." "Rachel would have loved that," Wilson said warmly. "She always said the hardest part of her job was seeing families struggle with bureaucracy while grieving." "I remember," Celeste replied. "She used to stay late filling out extra paperwork, making sure families got everything they were entitled to." She paused, looking at the headstone. I think it's time I started letting people in again. 20 years is a long time to be alone." Wilson squeezed her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. The foundation will need a good lawyer. If you're interested in some pro bono help." Celeste felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the simple human connection she'd denied herself for so long. "I'd like that." As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Celeste stopped. Without hesitation, she removed her oversized coat, the one she'd worn for so long to hide her tattoo. The morning sun warmed her shoulders, the phoenix tattoo visible and proud. "No more hiding," she said, draping the coat over her arm. "Rachel taught me to face things head on. It's time I started living that way again." Wilson nodded in understanding. "She'd be proud of you, Celeste, not just for bringing Thornfield to justice, but for finding your way back to the light." Together, they walked through the rows of white headstones, each step taking them toward a future where truth had triumphed over deception, and healing could finally begin. Celeste's coat remained draped over her arm, no longer a shield to hide behind, but a reminder of a chapter now closed. The morning sun caught the phoenix tattoo, making it seem to shimmer with life. Like the mythical bird it represented, Celeste had risen from the ashes of Flight 847. But this time, she rose not seeking vengeance but carrying forward Rachel's true legacy, protecting and helping others, standing strong in the light of truth. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.